Chapter 22. All in the Family. "Look, I want to apologize," Sam replied as we walked into the practice room. "What?" I replied obliviously. "You know, for what I said about you," he replied in an apologetic tone. I shook my head, realizing what he was talking about. It slipped my mind that we even had a fight. He just looked at me, waiting for me to respond. I went over the argument from minutes earlier. I remembered the feelings I had of betrayal, anger, and for a time, guilt, and I distanced myself from the situation, understanding Sam had a point in what he said. I allowed it to pass. Not totally, but for the time being, it had to be put on the back burner for the greater good. "Forget it, let's just focus on this," I replied, signaling for him to follow. He looked taken aback by my response. He stood in place for a second, then gave an awkward nod and followed me to the center of the training floor. "Okay, what's first?" he replied in a shrugging manner. "Well, first we have to learn to work as a two-man unit. So, as for the simulation, we're going to go back to the Battle of New Angeles. Let's see where we went wrong." He nodded, happy to hear it. "Just a simulation, though," I explained, trying to temper him. He nodded, jumping and bounding from foot to foot like a boxer before a fight. I know, but I still want to see how far I've come since then," he replied. I sighed, still blown away by his energy and constant enthusiasm. I stared at him and steadied him, signaling we were about to begin. "Okay, on the count of 3, okay?" I replied, turning to him as I readied my stance. "Simulation. Battle of New Angeles, 7:45 ER time, latitude 34.05, longitude 118.3895. Go!" A burst of light blasted as we shot through a time warp scene, landing in our precise spots from the day of the Battle of New Angeles. Before I could react, Sam had already leaped into action. "Sam!" I replied, leaping behind him. Wham! Wham! Swirl! Slam! Wham! Sam was ferocious in his technique. Every move led to the next. It was clunky, but brutal. This wasn't the same Sam. He nailed one with a front kick, taking the momentum into a flipping razor kick, then bouncing into a clothesline before catching another beast with one hand, spinning him around like a javelin before slinging him like a dart to the ground below. It was impressive to watch. It took him seconds to destroy the whole platoon. He landed with a smile as the simulation disappeared. "Whoa!" he yelled. "Awesome! Did you see that? What was that, 12 seconds?" I shook my head, realizing the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. "Sam," I replied, interrupting him. "2! That means both of us. You forgot about me." He looked around, excited, before my words brought him crashing back to Earth. "Oh, my bad," he replied. "It's cool though, don't have a cow. We'll just do it again." I grunted, then moved my arm, signaling the simulation to come back up. I raised my hand, doing the countdown with my fingers this time. 3, 2, 1, boom! "You go high," I replied. "I go low, just like with the flight pods during the trial simulation." He nodded, leaping into action. I followed right on his hip. "Right," I commanded. "Punch!" He smashed into a guy on his right. "Pow!" I cleaned up an attacking beast with a swift roundhouse. "Barrel roll toss," I replied, grabbing one more beast. "Swift toss, boom!" I flipped and tossed a beast towards Sam. He flipped and nailed the beast with a front heel kick that sent it hard toward the surface below. It exploded into the ground as we continued. "Switch!" he replied, flipping sides with me. Bam! I flipped over his back with a cutting wind-aided side kick that nearly sliced the beast in half. "Sam, clear!" I replied, as all the beasts attacked at once. "Electric shock!" "Element Alpha, light energy, static shock!" Sam commanded. Zap! I flashed to the ground, clearing it out as Sam sent a burst shock from his body that sizzled the remaining beasts. We stood in the middle of the carnage we administered as their sizzling bodies dissolved into ashes all around us. I shook my head. The difference was so evident. We had a natural chemistry. "Yeah!" Sam replied, jumping on my back. "Come on, we were awesome! We're going to own tomorrow!" "Sam, get off of me," I replied, fighting him off as I dusted myself off, annoyed. I was happy with the improvement, but I was more than sure that things weren't going to be as easy tomorrow. We fought low-level lycanthropes, and as impressive as our first run-through was, it didn't fill me with confidence about traveling back to the Earth realm. If this undertaking was really worse than everyone we participated in so far, this was going to be epic, and in order to succeed, Sam was going to have to be nearly flawless. "It was great," I replied, trying to temper him, "but you have no idea how powerful these guys are. I've faced them in 2 separate undertakings, and from what Jade said, yours is going to be worse. They are brutal, bloodthirsty, and vicious. This isn't a game. I'm glad we can work together, but we have to get a lot better, or one of us could be killed." He moved his head up and down, agreeing. He was still breathing hard from his last fight. "Sam," I continued, "do you remember what Pete and I said about fighting?" He stood for a second, contemplating my words. What was it again?" he replied in a dense manner. I threw my hands up in frustration. "Sam, that's the problem," I replied, trying to filter my words in an attempt to temper myself. Sam didn't grow up in Angel Haven. I couldn't expect him to be advanced as the rest of us. I paused, taking a deep breath. I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder before continuing. "Dude, I know at some point I'm going to regret telling you this, but I'll just have to tell myself it was for the greater good. Regardless, Sam, you're fearless, and as much as I'm going to hate telling you this when you're walking around like a cocky twit, I admire that about you. Truthfully, I wish I was half as courageous as you. You have nerves and a faith in Father Yahweh that's hard to match." He fought back a smile, proud to hear my words as I shrugged and awkwardly continued. "But as admirable as that trait is, it also has its drawbacks. Point being, you go into fights throwing caution to the wind. You don't use your head. I understand you're an attacker, but you have to learn to use all the techniques you spend hours practicing. Combat is about strategy, planning, and taking advantage of the mistakes of your opponent. You can't do all that without using all the tools Father Yahweh gave me. You're smarter than people think. Use your brain along with the talent you have, and trust me, we might be able to get through this thing," I shot, squeezing his shoulder, trying to make him understand what I was saying. He shook his head, objecting hesitantly. "I hear you, Tim, but honestly, that nerdy crap isn't me. That's not how I fight. I'm about smashing people. I can take punishment and learn from it. I can change the way I fight based on the mistakes I made," he argued. "It helps me train and perfect my mistakes so I can better the next time I fight." "If you keep making the mistakes you do, there won't be a next time, Sam. Not for you, and not for the people that fight alongside you. Me, Eve, Sai, all of us, you put us in danger. We have to move as one. Don't you get it? If we aren't on the same page, people will use your mistakes to get to the rest of us," I shot angrily. I know you don't want that on your conscience. I get it. You fight using your instincts and reflexes. You can still fight like that. But there is a difference from using instincts and winging it, hoping to land knockout blows. You can't be so reckless. Sam, you may be invincible, but the rest of the crew is not," I shot. "We can't afford to take those losses stumbling to get things right." He nodded in agreement, taking in my words with a guilty exhale. "You have to be more disciplined," I continued. "I'm not asking you to change the way you fight completely. I'm just asking you to tweak it a little. For example, look at the results of that last simulation. Did you catch the difference between when you took on the demons solo and when we did it together? How long did it take you to attack all those beasts individually? Compare it to how long did it take when we dissected and used our skills to corner them into a position for your final knockout blow. He smiled, taking in the advantage. I sighed, not wanting to bury him. That is the beauty of using your head. You use less energy. Dissect your opponent and use his flaws to your advantage. You have the temperament. Now all you need is to add a little nerd to your palate, I continued, causing him to chuckle. Seriously, Sam, this is about making you better. He perked up, raising his head. What if... he responded, pausing, obviously too embarrassed to finish the statement. Tim, you really think I could be as smart as the rest of you guys? I sighed, squeezing his shoulder in a consoling manner once more. Nobody's saying you have to be as smart as us, I replied sympathetically. But if I had to answer the question, of course you could if you already aren't. You are you, and just like we need Jacob's and Danielle's discipline, Sai's heart, Pete and Uriah's mind, Eve and Luke's edge, and Zek and Joe's innocence, we need you to be exactly the way you are. We understand how exceptional the kids are in Angel Haven, but that doesn't make our capacity for intelligence greater than yours. We've just been pushed to our potential. You're just as smart as any of us. We've just been asked to mature faster because of the tragedies in our town. You just happen to move into a town of weirdos. He smiled slightly, then responded with another nod of his head. So, what do you think I have to do to get as smart? I mean, how do I use my head more? He replied in asking tone. I don't know, but it starts with utilizing everything you have at your disposal, I replied. Your stamina, faith energy, your speed, power, and quickness. He nodded approvingly. My point is, we told you to use your elemental powers more often in our last sparring session, I replied. Did you try to implement that at all? Well, yeah, but... he replied, hesitating. But what? I pressed. Look, it's too dangerous, he replied in a pressing manner. I paused, taking a second to understand what he was referring to before turning to him. The white flame? I replied, exasperated. How long has this been going on? He looked down, trying to avoid eye contact, trying to hide his reluctance to talk about it. Since we got here, he replied. I told you last time. It's always there. I can feel it every time I try to use my powers. I nodded in an accepting manner. So, how do you think we overcome it? I replied, trying to be understanding. He shot a surprised, taken-back look and shook his head. We don't, he replied. You saw what happened last time. I'm not playing with it anymore. I shook my head, angrily walking toward him. I tried to be tactful and respectful of his situation, but it was a handicap we couldn't afford. How can he fight if he never maximizes his potential? I can be respectful of his reservation when I figured it was an added dimension. Now he was saying keeping the flame at bay was handicapping the rest of his powers. I had to do something. If he couldn't fight at full strength, then he was a danger to both of us. No, don't you get it? I pleaded. By handicapping yourself, you're putting us in just as much danger. Look at the Battle of New Angeles. You should have let us know what was going on. You didn't, and that handicap could have placed the rest of us in danger. He lowered his head. I wasn't trying to, he replied. I wanted to say something, but Jade told me not to. He said it was best to leave it out until I could control it. I was blown away. His faith energy was ridiculous, but the fact that he was holding back the entire time, it was scary to consider how powerful he actually was. So, you're saying this entire time you have been reserving your faith energy? I asked, shaking my head. You can't be serious. That seemed like a better idea to you? Sam, that is so stupid. You can't keep doing that. He shot an angry glare as his chest took in air. Well, excuse me. I'm sorry if I didn't want to lose another group of friends and family to this stupid thing, he shot angrily. I'm not asking you to understand why I did what I did, but don't judge why I did it. It's not stupid to not want to destroy everything around you." I stopped, looking away as the frustration started to build in both of us. "Well, what do you think our plan of action is?" I replied. "Because I can't help you not use your God-given ability. That would be a waste of time. If you're not going to commit to your best, this whole thing is an exercise in futility. It's idiotic." His eyes flared up at the sound of my words. "Don't call me an idiot, Tim," he grunted, walking into my space. I challenged him, stepping forward, refusing to back down. "I didn't say you were an idiot. I said this would be idiotic," I replied. "I'm not Psy. I can't say it nicer than that. We are fighting for people that matter more than us worrying about what people will think of us. We are here to learn to control our powers. We're not here to restrain them." We stood face to face. Neither one of us was going to back down. "This is why you get on my nerves," he replied. "You're so snotty and dismissive of everything as being stupid. I don't care who you are and what you think. I can get good enough without that. I just need time. I'm getting there." I shook my head in frustration and anger. "No, you're not," I replied, speaking outside of myself. "Power doesn't work like that. That power is just as much yours as the power you feel comfortable using. Think about it. They're one and the same. And as you become stronger, that power will grow as well. You'll have to exert more power to restrain it. It's already causing you to lag. How can you ever hope to keep up with the rest of us if you continue to do that?" He turned away, frustrated and ashamed. I wanted to tell him it wasn't him or his power that killed his brother. As far as I knew, it probably wasn't him who killed his godmother. He was backing me into a corner, and we needed him at his best. "So what am I supposed to do?" he responded. "Just let this thing run wild and destroy everything around me? It's not happening. I won't let it." I knew he meant what he said. He wasn't going to budge. He was stubborn, but I couldn't act like I couldn't understand why. I did, and honestly, I wished things could have been different. I wished I could tell him we didn't have to work with the power he feared, but we were short on time, and I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. "Listen," I replied, "is there a more efficient way to control this thing?" "Tim, I have no idea what a more efficient way means," he shot, staring at me like I was the dense one. "I mean, what if you don't fully release it? What if there is a way for you to channel more power to you? What if you don't have to exert every ounce of the power you do to holding the spirit back?" He sighed optimistically, taking in my words. "It's worth a try, but I'm not going all out like the last time," he replied. "We are only going to do so much. I'm serious, Tim." I nodded, accepting his terms. I was happy I was able to make some headway, because I was pretty sure our argument was going to be a back and forth of stubborn ideas and reservations. "So, how do I do it?" he replied. I stopped for a minute, going over his words. I dissected and broke down everything I saw. We went over everything. "Well, you say it's stronger when you fully release it, right?" I asked with a pointing finger snap. "So we'll start out slow, then gradually see if we can use more of the power as time goes by. I can withstand it, and last time I was even able to restrain it. Well, not me, but whatever this spirit is in me." He raised a brow at my words. "Wait, you have a spirit in you?" he replied, surprised. I nodded, acknowledging his words. "Yeah, I tried to tell you last time, but you didn't give me a chance," I continued. "When you blacked out the last time, a spirit emerged and protected me." "So you have a spirit that comes out of you as well?" he replied. "Does it work like mine?" I jostled, not really wanting to get too far into it. I knew explaining it to Sam was not going to be easy, and I didn't have time to waste failing to do so. "Well, no," I replied, shaking my head. "Or at least, I don't think it does. Yours was more aggressive. The spirit I saw surrounding me was more protecting me. Yours seemed to take you over." He nodded, slightly upset. But it was good, I continued, because I think it was trying to show me that we needed to work together to control both of the spirits in us. He looked at me with a dizzied glare. What do you mean? He questioned. It said the lion needs the lamb. Your spirit is in the shape of a lion, and the spirit that covered me was in the shape of a lamb. My guess is there's a connection there, I replied. What? He responded, oblivious. I shook my head and scratched my scalp, annoyed. Forget it. I believe they somehow work together. Let's just see how, I replied, giving up. He waited for a second, then finally relented. Okay, how? He replied. I hesitated, understanding what I was about to say wasn't going to go over well. You're going to have to let that spirit out again, I replied. He looked and rolled his eyes, exhausted. How is that gradual, Tim? I'm not going to let that thing out again, he shot. Didn't you hear me? I cut my eyes, exhausted with the back and forth. Of course, but I'm not saying release it at once. I'm saying a little at a time, like we agreed, I replied. But the end goal is fully releasing it. He sighed, staring at me before nodding in agreement. Okay, well, let's get going. At this rate, we're going to spend more time talking than training, I sighed. You got that right, Sam agreed. We both headed to the center of the ring. I raised my hand, signaling for him to give me a chance to get ready. My eyes lit up as I dropped into stance and signaled for him to begin. Sam closed his eyes as the light exploded. I followed suit, trying to channel the spirit from the day before. So, are you ready? I questioned. Yeah, let's do it, Sam replied. But like the last time, if you can't control it, get out of here. I nodded in agreement. Element Alpha, light energy, light reactor, he replied. Strike, static, strike, spark! He sparked before he looked like a static reactor. Sam struggled to control it as the static electricity around him sparked chaotic. I dodged as the strikes lashed out fiercely. Alright, you have got to control it. Light energy is wild and aggressive. Remember what Jade said, positive wrath, I replied. Spark, static, spark, strike, spark. It continued to spark wildly. He wasn't controlling it with authority. He was merely corralling the energy in a vacuum. The power was going to spark out of control. He collapsed to a knee, looking at me desperately. That's enough, he replied. It's going to come out. I have to power down. No, I replied, stopping him. It's all in your head. You're not even using 10% of your capacity right now. Besides, I know that's spirit energy. It's not here. Just focus on the positive aggression. Think about what you're fighting for. Light energy has to have an aim. It's not used to protect, it's used to attack, so aim the aggression at a purpose. Spark, boom, static. He slowly started to stabilize, rising to his feet. I sighed as I finally took control of it, but as soon as he stabilized, I could feel the spirit rising in him. I wanted to say something, but I needed him to overcome it. So I ignorantly didn't speak up, arrogantly believing I could control things. Do you feel it? He asked, still paranoid. Don't focus on that, Sam, I replied, trying to stop him before he went out of control again. Spark, spark! Sam shot the light energy all over the place at will. Awesome, he replied. His power was on par with anybody I had seen thus far. It was amazing how much faith energy he had as he continued to power up. I slowly felt the presence of the spirit becoming stronger and stronger. Okay, Sam, pull it back a little, I replied. I can feel the spirit. Sam ignored my words, summoning spinning wind and water. I feel so powerful, he said, controlling the elements like a vet. He was drunk with the power of it as he moved the elements like a puppeteer. I ignored, continuing to move and amp up his power. His power was intimidating, even for me. What we saw as a weak ability was actually showcasing itself as a truly powerful asset. The fact that he had amazing stamina made it so he didn't feel the fatigue that the rest of us did when we used our ability. Watching him was like watching a guy hold his breath underwater for an hour. It was an amazing feat. He used all his abilities at once, and it looked effortless. "Sam, I'm serious," I replied, trying to calm him as the presence was full-blown at this point. "Pull back." But before he could respond, he collapsed in the middle of the sparring arena. "Sam?" I replied, approaching him cautiously. His body lifted like someone was pulling him with an invisible puppet string. I recoiled at the sight. Boom! Whack! The explosion of power slammed me into a nearby wall. My body ached as I crawled back to my feet. "Sam!" I screamed, trying to reach out to him and break him out of his trance. Sam was out on his feet. The aura of the white flame around him morphed into the shape of the lion as the air became deathly cold. "Sam!" I screamed helplessly. The power became so dense that it virtually looked like a solid white lion with a mane of flames. I stood in awe as it towered above me. It yelped, breathing out an icy breath through its nose like a bull. I backed away slowly as it seemed to drop into a prancing stance. "Tim?" said a voice, catching me off guard. "What's going on?" I turned to see Sai, Eve, Beth, and Danielle standing at the entrance to the training room. "Get out!" I screamed, pointing toward the door as I sprinted toward them. They all stared in shock at the monstrous spirit standing in front of me. "What is that?" said Eve. Is that Sam?" "Go!" I screamed, trying to force them to leave. Before I could react, the lion shot for them. Eve quickly shoved Beth out of the way, taking Danielle with them, as Sai turned to exit as well. But before she could, the door froze over. "Ouch!" she yelled, recoiling from the freezing cold knob. Boom! The door exploded as Sai narrowly dove out of the way. I sighed, realizing we were trapped inside this training dimension with a beast. I flashed, grabbing Sai, landing in shield stance, blocking her. "Sam!" I screamed, praying there was still some way I could get through to him. "Sam, you can control it!" I looked down at my body, hoping to see the other spirit, but it was absent. I was unprotected. I was vulnerable. The suffocating dry fire began to pollute the area. "That's really Sam?" Sai replied, looking at it in horror as she fought to her feet. "Well, yes and no. It's the white flame spirit. It's a spirit that takes Sam over when he uses too much of his power," I replied, shielding her. The beast walked back and forth, stalking us, waiting to pounce. What was it waiting for? It didn't attack, but I still refused to take my eyes off of it for a second. "Do you have your dimension jumper?" I asked, not even looking back. As I spoke, Sai walked up beside me. "No, and even if I did, you think I'd leave you here all alone?" she replied. "Now, how do we stop this thing?" I shrugged, not knowing what to say. "I thought I had the power to stop it like the last time," I replied, "but I don't know how to use it." "What are you talking about last time?" she replied. "This happened before?" "Roar!" the spirit yelped, staring at us. "Yes, but Sam made me promise not to tell anyone," I replied. "I felt I could handle it. Regardless, the last time I had a spirit that came out of me as well." "Wait, what?" she whimpered, as the spirit began to creep towards us. "It's a long story," I replied angrily. "I'll explain things later. The point is, the spirit protected me the last time. This time it's not here, and we're in trouble. What are you guys doing anyway?" "Uriah said you got in a fight with the Alphas. Pete had to go to the MedCorps. We were just making sure you and Sam were all right," she answered, inching away from the beast behind my shielding body. Whoosh! Before I could react, the spirit shot toward us. "Sai!" I screamed, signaling for her to dodge. She shot in one direction and I shot the other way. Zip, zip, zip! Sai catapulted in the air and unloaded arrows at the spirit that had little to no effect. "Roar!" the spirit let out, charging toward her. Swift boom! I built a gust of wind up and used it as a buffer as I charged into the spirit, blindsiding it just before it reached Sai. I released the wind as it almost froze on contact, diving for safety. I stared at Sai in awe. "What type of... It froze the wind on contact?" I replied, turning to Sai. "I saw. Tim, look at my arrows," she replied, pointing to the center of the floor. Her lightning shots were frozen in the center of the arena. What type of fire freezes lightning? "We can't let this thing touch us," I replied, turning to Sai. "It'll freeze us." Sai nodded as the spirit beast circled around and charged again. "Jump!" I replied as we leaped over its head. I shuddered in horror as the spirit's body grew an arm that seemed to emanate from its back. It was going for Sai. She was oblivious. I had to act. Swift! I shot toward her, knocking her out of the hand's path, creating a dense wind as the arm enveloped me. "Tim!" she screamed as she flew toward the ground. I covered myself as the wind froze, encasing me into a marble-like ball. "Element Gamma, Fire Command, Inferno!" I replied, emitting as much fire as I could to counteract the temperature. I watched as I began to freeze. I stared at the condensing wind. It was a scary scene that both shocked and frightened me. I cringed as the frozen wind ball stopped before reaching me. I stared, looking around to see what happened as the ice marble I was encased in exploded. "Tim," said a voice I had never heard before. I turned and gasped at the sight. The air seemed to come out of my body. It was Sai, but as the smog of the ice dissipated, I could see a face that was familiar, yet it had to be something out of a dream. "Mom?" I replied as I slowly hit the ground with a thud. The feeling of my body hitting the pavement didn't register through my exuberance. "Mom!" I replied, hurriedly scraping my body off the ground. The woman I perceived to be my mother shook her head as I finally cleared the cobwebs and could see better. I turned over and got a good look. "Who are you?" I replied, sitting up and dusting myself off. She smiled, placing her hand on Sai's shoulder, staring me up and down. I looked her in the eye, racking my brain, trying to figure out who she was and why she looked so similar to my mother. "Hi," she replied, emotional as she stared at me. "I'm your grandmother, Natasha." I nodded as a part of me seemed drawn to her. Her eyes, lips, nose, she was the spitting image of my mother. Apart from a slight feeling of nostalgia, I was a blank canvas. I didn't know how to react. I just stood looking at her. She was in a young form, which made the whole situation feel weirder. She looked to be about 30 years old, and she was telling me she was my grandmother? It took a while to wrap my head around the whole thing. She stood back hesitantly, waiting on my reaction. "Well, this is Tim," Sai replied. "He is not used to seeing a grandmother who looks as young as his mother, or looks so much like his mother, for that matter." She laughed, smiling. "Well, he's not the first person to mistake me for his mother," she replied. "It's practically my identity. I even added this gray streak to make us more distinguishable, but I still get the occasional fan. It's okay, though. I don't mind. She's my baby, and you couldn't find a prouder mother, or, as of late, a grandmother." A part of me wanted to run to her, but a part of me still saw her as a stranger. The fact that she looked like my mom made it worse. I jostled for a second. Then, like my body was moving on its own, I sprinted toward her and squeezed her like she was someone I hadn't seen in years. She tumbled backwards, hugging me. She caressed my head like a loving grandmother. I couldn't control my emotions as tears formed in my eyes. Sai stared at me, surprised by my reaction. I never knew my mother or anything about her, and even though I knew she wasn't my mother, I still hugged her like she was. She gave me a loving kiss on the forehead as tears formed in her eyes as well. "Sadly, I know exactly what you're going through," she replied, lovingly tilting her head, resting it on mine. "Because it's been a while since I've seen my daughter also, and you look so much like my Leah." Sai teared up watching us. I never talked much about my mother to Sai. We both respected the privacy asked from the other. We both understood talking about the pain wouldn't help. She didn't talk about her mother, and I never talked about mine. She remembered feeling the same when she found out her mother had come to see her, and she missed her. It took her hours to get over the feeling of loss all over again. If anybody knew what I was going through, it was her. I'm sure it was a surprise for her to see me so emotional. I don't think she had ever seen me cry before that. She stood staring at us with a smile as tears streamed down her face. "And here I was afraid you wouldn't know who I was," she replied, wiping her tears with a laugh. "But it seems you've heard of me." Sai smiled as she explained. "It's actually a coincidence," she replied. "Jade explained Tim's mother's past a little while ago." She acknowledged Sai's word with a nod. I finally released as she pulled back and stared in my face, wiping the faint tears in my eyes. "Well, I'm sorry. I can't remember any of it before I got here. I wanted to leave that life behind me and enjoy eternity," she replied, looking me in the eyes. "But I followed my little girl her entire life, intervening when I could. I'm actually the one who led her to your grandparents." She smiled, turning to Sai as she spoke. Sai's eyes twinkled at the sound of her words. "Yeah, they were strong Christians, which you may or may not know allows us to use them," she continued, hugging Sai. "I'm guessing your host also told you about Philip?" Sai gave an acknowledging nod. I was still speechless as she hugged me with one arm wrapped around me and the other around Sai. I was in awe of this woman. The story from Jade replayed in my head. The compassion I felt was unlike anything I had felt before. I was a guy who grew up in a house of men. I never experienced a feminine touch, and I was soaking it up as she shook me and Sai in a loving manner. "Yes, I'm sorry about everything that happened to you," I responded. "You know, with your son." She nodded, kissing me once more. "I've had a lot of time to accept the way things are. I've prayed for my son, and I have faith he can be saved. I have come to peace with the possibility that he may not. My son has done a lot of things I haven't understood in his time on Earth," she replied, visibly emotional. "I like to think it's his father's doing, but—" She paused, looking away as she fought back emotion. "I'm not here to sour my first meeting with my beautiful grandson and his little girlfriend," she replied, squeezing us both. I shuddered in embarrassment as I looked at Sai. She seemed to be dealing with something similar. She lowered her head as we both turned to speak. "She's not my girlfriend," I replied with a chuckle. Sai added to my words with a roll of her eyes. "It's just some angle our crazy agent is pushing," she replied in an exasperated tone. "Tim and I are just really good friends. Maybe not good enough friends for him to tell me before he actually got a girlfriend, but that's neither here nor there." She smiled and stared at me with an accusing glare. I lowered my head bashfully as she slugged me on the shoulder. "Oh, well, I'm sorry," she replied. "Being married to one of the most powerful men in the media, I should know a little more about how the whole thing works. Regardless, I've never seen them work an angle where they tell their clients to act to play up a story." Sai and I uncomfortably stared at each other, playing mental double dutch about who would take up the burden of explaining things. I exhaled in a frustrated manner before stepping up. "Well, that part, it isn't," I stuttered, causing my grandmother to give me a prodding smile. We are that close. Ryan is just manipulating our bond into some love story." She couldn't fight a playful smirk as Sai and I jostled between looks of embarrassment and frustration. "Yes, I guess I can see that," she joked, causing us both to blush at her insinuations. "But still, I have to give the guy credit. He had me fooled. I was convinced you guys made the cutest couple in the heaven realm." She was a beautiful woman. I kicked at the ground nervously, hoping she would drop the embarrassing conversation. She answered my prayers and turned to Sam. "Sammy," she replied, walking over to Sam's lifeless body. Her words brought back a pressing issue. Looking at her wardrobe, she didn't look to be a guardsman. She wore a MedCorps uniform. I looked her over, more convinced than ever she wasn't the one who saved me. "I'm guessing, I'm sorry, but I don't know what to call you," I replied. "I mean, do they call people grandmother? I mean, you look so young, and I have to imagine the family line goes back too far in this realm for that." She chuckled, looking at me, shaking her head. "You're a very observant kid," she responded. "But trust me, I've been waiting for someone to call me Nana for the longest time. It'll be an honor." I smiled as I continued. "Well, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure you didn't save me," I replied, looking at Sai as I spoke, then back to her. "I mean, you don't look like a guardsman. You look more like MedCorps." She nodded with a smile. "Once again, very observant," she replied. "I am with the MedCorps, the head of subatomic cellular regeneration in the Zeta Gamma 941239 quadrant. I'm here working and looking over the Light Guard trials. I was able to find you here because I'm your grandmother, and a concentrated part of my energy dwells in you and Sam. I didn't know what I was going to do, but when I got the SOS level rise in your BAU, I couldn't just stand by. So, I shot here immediately, and when I got here, I thought it was too late," she replied, turning back to me sorrowfully. I stared at Sai, begging for a translation. "Yeah," Sai cut in hesitantly. "We both thought it was over." "What happened?" I replied. "Your body had this weird white light that came out and changed into the form of this alien face and protected you," she explained. "Alien? A lamb, you mean?" I pressed, as she thought about my words and agreed. "You're right, it was a... My gosh, it was a lamb," she pressed, as if she was confused at how she didn't put it together. Her words gave me pause. I never saw it. I didn't feel it. How can a power that is powerful enough to fight off Sam's be so transparent? It had me worried. I couldn't control it. I couldn't even call on it. Why was it there, and what was it? Questions ran through my mind as I turned to them with an expression that showed my naivete. "It's the power I was telling you about," I said, turning to Sai. "The one that saved me last time." She looked at me, a little taken aback by my words. "I thought you couldn't control it," she pressed. I shrugged my shoulder with an agreeing nod. "Well, I couldn't. I mean, I can't. It must be like a failsafe, or maybe it works like my other ability and only comes out when I sacrifice myself to save someone," I replied. She looked confused by my words, tilting her head slightly. "Wait, I thought your ability to manifest when you tried to outdo people," Sai replied. I shook my head before she even finished her words. "No, Jacob told me it comes from my ability to do whatever it takes to save people," I replied. "He says that's why I always copy abilities in times where I seem to need them the most." She nodded, agreeing with my words. I shook my head quickly and adamantly. "But it's confusing. It came out the last time, and as far as I know, I didn't sacrifice myself for anyone," I replied. "It might be something Sam and I have in us, but my guess is my power is dormant because mine is passive, and his aggressive." Nana Natty just looked on as we went back and forth. She kneeled, dropping down, using a hologram to check Sam's vitals as she cut in. "What makes you think that?" she pressed. Well, this spirit or something was speaking to me the last time the two spirits emerged. It said the lion needs the lamb. Guessing by the spirit's shape it was talking about us, I responded. Nana Natty's eyes raised at the sound of my words. What did you say? She pressed, furrowing her brow. When? I responded, confused by her reaction. Just now, she responded. I was saying the spirits were in the shape of a lion and lamb, I replied, giving her the ammunition she was asking for to answer the question. No, you said a lion and a lamb, she explained. I've heard that before. Yeah, me too, Sai replied. What? You have? I pressed. She waited hesitantly, allowing a second to pass in an asking manner. After both me and Nana Natty just stared at her, she continued. Lion and lamb is all over the Bible, especially in the book of Isaiah, she responded. Isaiah chapter 11 verse 6, the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. Also Isaiah chapter 65 verse 25, the wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock, and dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, saith the Lord. That's interesting as well, Nana Natty replied, cutting in. But that's not what I meant. When I was in the earth realm, my first and current husband would say it all the time during his sermon. He would say the lion needs the lamb, and lamb can't survive without the lion. Her words caught my attention as I tried to decipher the message she was telling me. Do you know what he meant? I asked, waiting with bated breath. She stopped for a second, pouting her lips in a leveling manner. He used to say it meant to be a true Christian you need to be compassionate and ready to sacrifice, yet you still had to have a fighting spirit that was relentless and fearless. He said it was the two sides of Christ. He was the Lion of Judah, yet he was the sacrificial lamb as well, she explained. I nodded at her words, but at the time I couldn't understand how it was connected. There was definitely a correlation between me, Sam, and her characteristics of a true Christian, but at the time it didn't bring me any closer to understanding how to use the power I had. Well, whatever it means, we'll figure it out, but as for now, is Sam all right? I responded, dropping down next to him. If he's not, we're kind of screwed. They both chuckled at the sound of my words. No, he's fine, relatively speaking, Nana Natty replied, rubbing Sam's forehead. He's just shot. He'll be fine by tomorrow morning. I'll give him something to keep him out until then. I shook my head adamantly, challenging her words. Wait, you can't do that, I replied quickly. We still have to train for tomorrow. She shook her head, disagreeing right away. Even if there was some way he could, his faith energy is shot. He's barely sustaining a material state at this point. If you really care about him competing tomorrow, he's going to need rest to restore his faith energy. Without it, he doesn't stand a chance going into his trial at full power. And considering what it entails, he can't afford to do that. The wind seemed to come out of my body at the sound of her words. I rolled my eyes in an exasperated manner. I wanted to stomp around like a stubborn 5-year-old. Here we were on the eve of the deciding battle of the trials, and the most indestructible member of our legion was sidelined. There was no way we were going to be ready for tomorrow. Things couldn't have ended worse. Man, I grunted in frustration. As I yelped, a wormhole opened as Luke, Jacob, Danielle, Beth, and Eve stepped through, catching our attention. Tim, Eve replied, running over to me, throwing her arms around me. I'm guessing this is the, you know, Nana Natty whispered to Sai, pointing at Eve. Sai nodded bashfully, trying her best to be transparent. Eve leaned back, looking me over, as Jacob stood over her shoulder, checking me along with her. Are you okay? Eve replied. What happened? Jacob pressed, as the rest of them stared at me and Eve like we were oddities. I was training with Sam and we were trying to practice with his white flame, I replied, pointing towards Sam. Tim, why? Jacob pressed. Why would you do something like that without taking the proper precautions? I nodded, raising my hand, cutting him off before he wasted his breath. Yeah, I know, okay, I replied. Sam just made me promise not to tell anyone. I wouldn't have done it. It's just, Sam said it prevented him from using his anointed powers, so... As I spoke, Jacob's gaze turned to Nana Natty, and even in his faint way, I saw emotion deep in his eyes. He ignored me, staring at her as the rest of the Legion turned to her as well. Tim, said Eve, turning to her, is this your mother? No, Jacob replied immediately. It's my mother's mother, the one Jade told us about. As he spoke, he walked toward her as she rose and embraced him in a hug. Jacob, she replied, you are determined to outdo your mother, aren't you? I'm so proud of you. She squeezed him as he smiled from ear to ear. Thanks, he replied. What are you doing here, Nana? She pointed toward me and Sam. How do you know her? I responded, surprised by their interaction. Jacob turned to me with a smile. The day we ran into Sai's mother, she told me about her, he responded. I met her then. I stared at him expressionless. Why didn't you tell me? I replied. He cut his eyes at my words. It was the day before your trial, and she didn't need you coming in and asking her a million questions about Mom. Besides, I knew we'd see her after the trials, he explained. Wow, she looks just like your mom, Eve added. I'm going to go ahead and get Sam's treatment started. I'll catch up with you guys when this is all over with, she replied. I'm sorry he couldn't train. I wish I had better news, but if it's any consolation, I promise he'll be ready for tomorrow. I nodded in a relenting fashion as a light emanated, covering her and Sam. Wait, can you recreate their training doors so we can get out of here? I begged, quickly stopping. She smiled as her eyes lit up. The portal door pieces gathered until the door reformed itself. Well, there's some perks to be a subatomic physician, she replied. Anyways, it was nice meeting you guys, especially my grandkids. I love you guys, and we'll have a big dinner and get caught up. We all waved as the light dissipated. Man, I replied in anguish. What can you do? Jacob replied, catching me off guard. I expected him to be irritated, but he seemed to be calm about the situation. It was rare for him to actually throw me a bone. I was smart enough not to press him on it as he and Luke headed for the door. Sai and the rest of the girls surrounded around me and Eve. Tough, Sai replied, shaking her head. He'll make it, I replied confidently, if it takes everything I have. They all nodded. I moved before I was caught by Sai and Eve. Maybe you should lay down as well, Tim, Eve replied. Yeah, you don't look so good, Sai added. I nodded in agreement. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the morning, I replied, limping out with Eve and Sai holding me up. I stopped halfway to the door, then turned to Beth. Oh, and Beth, before I forget, Pete was pretty bummed out after your trial. I know with the interviews and craziness, you haven't really gotten a chance to talk, I explained, catching the girl off guard. I know it's kind of random, but he's been acting weird. I think he thinks you blame him for your loss. He tends to overanalyze things. Would you mind? Of course, Beth cut in before I finished the sentence. I've seen him a couple of times, but I didn't think he... You thought he was disappointed in you for losing, I responded, causing her to lower her head bashfully. Beth, you couldn't be further off. Pete was as proud as Eve about your performance. He would never hold animosity toward you for losing. Pete's not like that. He's quiet because he's trying to find the right way to say things, and he'll go over every scenario. Trust me, if you don't say something, he won't broach the subject until he is absolutely sure he has his words unquestionably right. He uses that brain of his to beat himself down. Even when he hasn't done anything wrong, he'll find a way to make it his fault. Judging by your statement, you two seem to share that trait." Eve and Sai looked at me with admiration before Eve cut in, chuckling to herself. "Tim, you're amazing. You do know that, don't you?" She responded with an exhausted chuckle, allowing me to rest on a nearby wall. "Here you are, burnt out and barely able to make it back to your room for the third night in a row after taking on the entire Legion, and the only thing on your mind is making sure you help Pete deal. Sometimes I think I'm living out some weird alternate reality, because it's hard to believe you're real at times." Sai nodded, agreeing with the girl, as I dismissed Eve's words as over-exaggeration. "Well, if you guys will excuse me, St. Timothy is turning in for the night," I responded, as they both patted me on the shoulder. "Thanks, Beth. I appreciate it." She smiled and blushed with a nod of her head as I disappeared in a show of light. She turned to Eve and Sai in a begging manner. "Have those two always been, like they are?" Beth shot timidly. "Pete and Tim, I mean." Sai nodded as Eve chuckled. "Yeah, Hikari explained day in and day out about the boys from 3 houses down, and I must say, I'm a believer," Eve responded, causing Sai to shrug, unable to put her thoughts in words. "Yeah, they're amazing guys, both of them," she explained with a sigh. "You said I told you day in and day out, but honestly, there hasn't been a day where my words have done them justice. I've been blessed to find the idiot and his best friend before beautiful girls like you two could come along and hoard in on things." The girls chuckled as I laid my head on the pillow. The entire scenario was chaotic and annoying. Regardless of the outcome, it wasn't going to be easy to take Sam. He was working with a handicap. Getting him through one of the hardest undertakings on the planet wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take another amazing performance by not just me, but Sam as well. I had goosebumps just thinking about it.